Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Kościuszko Foundation's webinar, A Lyrical Poet as a Political Writer, The Captive Mind by Czesław Miłosz, presented by Professor Bożena Shallcross and Professor Andrzej Karcz. My name is Ewa Zadworna. I'm Director of Cultural Affairs at the Foundation, and I'd like to welcome all our attendees who are joining us here today. I'm sure that to all viewers who are watching us now and who will be watching the recording of this webinar later on, Czesław Miłosz does need no introduction. Without a doubt, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, a writer, literary Nobel Prize winner, literary critic, translator, scholar, diplomat. The Captive Mind, one of his most famous and widely read works, which is the subject of today's discussion, has never gone out of the print since its first publication in 1953. Its Chinese edition, released in 2013, became one of the 10 best Chinese books of the year. And as simple Google search indicates, The Captive Mind continues to be a point of reference for writers and journalists around the world who write and comment on social and political issues happening nowadays, long after the end of the totalitarian 20th century the book is about. And speaking about nowadays, in 5 days, on June 30th, there will be 110 years since birth of Czesław Miłosz. This year also marks the round 70th anniversary since his escape from communist Poland to France, where he sought political asylum and where he wrote and first published The Captive Mind. Since then, since 1953, much has been said, written, published, and many events discussing the body of work of Czesław Miłosz took place at most prestigious venues around the world. Yet, given these round anniversaries, we could not to contribute to the overall effort to preserve the intellectual legacy of the writer. The discussion about his works simply must have been included in the Foundation's series of talks on Polish literature, which started this spring. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers in today's webinar. Bożena Shallcross is a professor of Polish literature and Polish Jewish cultural studies in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of Chicago, an essayist, translator, and art critic. She published several monographs, edited and translated volumes of texts by various authors, as well as numerous articles. Her research interests include interrelationship between Polish poetry and the visual arts, discourse on the home and identity, theories of vision, material culture and thing discourse, Holocaust studies, and contemporary Polish literature. Among her grants, fellowships, and awards, she appreciates the most the Polish government's award for outstanding achievement in promoting Polish culture in the world, awarded to her in 2002. And Professor Andrzej Karcz is Associate Professor in the Institute of Literary Research at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, Poland. He's an author of many scholarly publications, including Reflection on Literature in Polish Emigre Literature. He co-edited with Halina Filipowicz and Tamara Trojanowska a volume on research on Polish literature in North America from 1919 to 2005. He's also the editor of Czesław Miłosz, in English translation, My Vilnius Guardian, Letters to Manfred Kriedel. Professor Karcz's articles have appeared in Polish and American journals and edited volumes. His main research interests focus on literary theory, history of literary criticism, Polish prose of the 20th and the 20th centuries, Polish emigre literature, and Polish studies abroad. Professor Karcz holds a PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from the University of Chicago. This lecture is presented in cooperation with the Institute of Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences and is part of the Tadeusz Solowi Lectures of the Kościuszko Foundation. Before we begin, just a quick technical note to our attendees. This webinar is being recorded. It will be posted later on the Foundation's YouTube channel. Also, after the presentation by Professor Shallcross and Professor Karcz, we will have time for questions from the audience. So if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please do so throughout the talk using the Q&A feature. We'll get back to it after the presentation. And now, Professor Shallcross, Professor Karcz, welcome and thank you very, very much for accepting our invitation to give this talk. And now the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to say hello to everybody who is in attendance. I cannot see you, but I'm very much aware of the audience, of your presence. And I would like also to thank the Kościuszko Foundation, Pani Ewa Zadworna, for this opportunity, for inviting me for this event. I would like to have first a little mini lecture about Czesław Miłosz in a sort of a condensed manner. Among his many talents, Czesław Miłosz was endowed with a gift to grasp the essential characteristics of a person. He could portray a person in several sentences, usually followed by a biographical past and a reflective trajectory of his or her life events. These gestures allowed him to sketch many masterful portraits, some more biographical, others more existential. Some close to the genre of biographical fiction, some more strict as the lives of Alpha, Beta, and Delta in the captive mind. I deliberately skipped Gamma. I hope that we will have a chance to talk about this. But it is not my ambition to draw a biographical portrait of Czesław Miłosz. This has been already done by Andrzej in his monumental biography. Some remarks, nonetheless, are necessary. Between the poet's birth in 1911 and his death in 2004, so much happened. So many experiences were recorded, unrecorded. His good fortune and incredible artistic success were intertwined with squalor and tragic events. His life trajectory was so rich, long, and complex, as well as marked by history's interventions, to that extent that I find the often used formula of Miłosz as the witness of the era, of the bygone era, to be relevant. Between Szczecin of 1911 and Kraków of 2004, the places of his birth and death, he lived in many other places such as Vilna, Warsaw, Paris, New York, Berkeley, and wore many hats. First and foremost, a poet. He was also a diplomat, a radio journalist, an academic teacher who with great intensity wrote, explored, and meditated on the conundrums and shifts of his existence and the bygone era. What he did not expect to happen, happened. But what he prophesied also occurred. His intellectual journey was determined by World War II, the exile, his winning of the Nobel Prize, and a nearly miraculous return to his native realm, to his rodzinna Europa. And this brings us to the topic of today's meeting, the captive mind. And this is the English translation. The slender volume of essays that analytically narrate the consequences and motivations of communist takeover of Poland and offers for portraits that are framed theoretically. These portraits, lives in the sense of a genre, are of Jerzy Andrzejewski, Putrament, Tadeusz Borowski, and Konstanty Ildefons-Gałczyński. Just for the starter, these names are not given in the text, as if it was a pamphlet, an anonymous sort of a pamphlet, as if. For it seems to me that for Miłosz, the objective of demasking the results of embracing the new faith also was connected with the gesture of masking. I will stop here, and I would like to give the floor to Professor Karcz.
Thank you. In your introduction, you touched upon the most important points about Czesław Miłosz, the writer, and also you indicated the most important features of the captive. And I think these are very important facts. The thing that you mentioned, that the volume, The Captive Mind, is a collection of essays. The fact that you said that the book is about the communist takeover of Poland, and also the last thing, that the collection offers 4 portraits of Polish writers. I would say these are the 3 main features that we could, or we might focus on while talking about The Captive Mind by Czesław Miłosz. Let's perhaps talk about this problem of the content referring to politics, because we entitled our lecture saying that this is a lyrical poet who was a political writer at some point of his career. And this already introduces a lot of complex issues, it seems, some kind of contradiction perhaps. I will read a quote from Miłosz's essays. He wrote, "What do I have in common with The Captive Mind or the novel The Seizure of Power, which is in fact also to a large extent political? People are really ready to label me an expert on communism. Help! I'm a lyrical poet who was thrown into a bizarre well and tried as best he could to get out of it." End of quote. I think this statement tells us a great deal about the writer's dilemma. A lyrical poet who was thrown into a well of politics, and politics at the time of complexities or difficult events in Europe after the Second World War. So is this a contradiction? How should we view the fact that here we have a lyrical poet, metaphysical poet, who has to deal with the issues of politics, communism, Stalinism? Do you see this as a contradiction?
Actually, not at all. I think that we could start talking about destabilizing this opposition, talking about his sense of responsibility as a poet. But we could also talk about his political poetry. We could talk about his engagement in politics, a very complicated one. He was, after all, deeply rooted in the leftist type of thinking in his during the pre-war Poland. He was definitely very much aware of how much he was a part of the political scene of that time, and after the war it even intensified. Nonetheless, he was very often distancing himself from the world of politics, and didn't, like almost all of us, didn't like to be labeled in any way. And one of those labels was exactly that he was a political writer. Well, as maybe displeased he was, which of course we see that displeasure in the introduction to The Captive Mind. He also, because of this book, experienced some gains and some losses. He lost friends, but he also gained a certain recognition in the West. Again, like everything in his life, it wasn't a just simple pleasure of being recognized and famous, but it was very much a difficult situation in which he was criticized for this book and his evaluation of communist writers, of communist engagement, of socialist realist engagement. But on the other hand, there was a group of intellectuals who praised the book. And whether the book is still valid is actually not a question, of course. The book is still relevant to our times, but in a different way than it was when it first appeared. After all, it appeared, I believe, after a few months after Stalin's death. So it already the context radically began to change. It is the opposition that is the point of departure for our conversation. The opposition between a lyrical poet and a political writer is there. Obviously, when he writes his novels, or especially his second novel, or in this particular volume, or in many of his essays, he takes a clear political stance, but at the same time, in his analysis, we see how he is applying his sensitivity as a poet, his knowledge of poetry, how he actually has a very clearly informed sense of values about poetry and the writing, and how he applies it to his discussion of Ketman, or his discussion of those four authors. Well, I believe that this distinction between those two roles makes sense as a point of departure, and then it is a very quickly sort of destabilized and complicated, and it shows numerous interdependencies between him being a lyrical poet, but I would say even more so a metaphysical poet. Mm-hmm. And his poetry, his poetic treatises, for example, what to do with them.
Yes, indeed. I would say that stressing the fact that The Captive Mind is a only political book would be a kind of impoverishment of this work. This is much more than just politics. On the surface, it seems it is only that. This is only about politics and communism and the story of perhaps an explanation why Eastern European intellectuals embraced communism after the Second World War in Poland or in Eastern Europe in general. But there are many more deeper meanings in the book, and every literary scholar would agree that This is a very complex work, a literary work. This is indeed a work of literature and not a work of politics, not a work of political science or sociology. Although the book was received as such once it appeared. It is important to say that Miłosz analyzes certain processes that took place in Eastern and Central Europe after the Second World War. He speaks of an ideological offensive, terror, invasion, fear that people experienced in Poland. He also writes about people's attitudes toward the events of history. He writes about those people's convictions, that the victory of the doctrine of Marxism is inevitable. And Miłosz, which is already an indication how sophisticated the captive mind is, he talks about this ideology in terms of the new faith. And he analyzed adherence of this way of thinking. So
can we stop for a moment?
Yes.
Right here, the new faith, nowa wiara, is partly, I think, a term that, like several of his hybrid terms in the book, is coming from this parallel between the introduction of Christianity around the world, but probably also he has in mind the Polish lands, and the conversion to Christianity he compares to the way people embraced communism. And it is a very persuasive parallel. Of course, historically, it is not precise, but it all right away tells us that the new faith and the way of accepting communism and the way that people actually became such enthusiastic proponents of that new faith is telling us how he actually, what is the method, what is the mechanism that he wants to expose in the book. And it is really a sort of a taking over of an intellectual and his mind and his heart and his work. It is a sort of a nearly epiphanic experience. And this is, of course, a quite questionable, especially from his critics' point of view, because not only people were induced, lured to this new faith, and not only they truly believed in it, but there is also an element that Miłosz is, according to some of his critics, sort of not taking into consideration. And one of them is simply the opportunistic nature of the turn to communism, but probably even more so fear, and that fear that was injected through terror, the post-war terror, was that very much visible and literally obvious in the behavior of Polish literati. We know from the witnesses that Andrzej, when he had his speech in Szczecin, he was almost incapacitated. He was so taken by fear that he was so nervous that he barely could speak. And after all, that particular text was, was quite critical to the convention. So it's not just, the spontaneous or maybe more irrational acceptance of communism or Marxism, of thinking in a dialectical way about history, but there are also some psychological and very non-intellectual aspects of this whole process that he describes.
Miłosz indeed writes detail about, he describes the behavior of people, behind the Iron Curtain, and he tries to explain using different voices, we might say. The narrator uses different voices in the book. We even see the point of view of someone who is a communist. This is all done in order to explain the complexity of the situation. I think the tool you mentioned, the idea of new faith, is an interesting literary device, quite effective, even though it could be, questioned how faithful it was to present the situation after the Second World War in Eastern Europe. We might also indicate other similar ideas that are used in the book. It could be the notion of Ketman, and it could be the notion of the Marty Bing pill, the idea taken from Witkacy's novel Insatiability. I think Ketman is, in the captive mind, it is more visible than the idea of the pill Marty Bing, in Polish Marty Bing. It seems that Miłosz writes more about the idea of Ketman on many pages of the book. And this is an interesting concept. And in order to understand it, the reader must refer to Islam and a particular branch of Islam, Shia Islam, in order to understand this incredible attitude that Ketman expresses. We can read the definition of this in many sources, that Ketman, it can be spelled K-E-T-M-A-N or K-I-T-M-A-N. That according to which a believer can hide his or her own religious convictions when facing persecution. Ketman is a concealment of one's thoughts by silence or omissions, that it is an action of covering, a deception, a game, a pretend attitude, an adaptation to the environment. But Ketman is also a manifestation of internal freedom. So when Miłosz describes, the four, not as much the four writers, but in general, when he describes the attitudes of people under communism, and especially at the time of Stalinism in Poland, he uses quite effectively this notion to present how people behave, what psychological states they go through in order to live in the new circumstances.
Yes, but the way you described it, it sounds like, it is just a sort of a hypocrisy, a more or less universal characteristic of a human being. What is Hetmanesque about this strategy, this hypocritical strategy of concealment? What is it? It's exactly the political language and the political ideas. There is a huge gap between Islam and communism in its Polish or Soviet versions. And actually, he is working very much on familiarizing that notion that he takes from a different culture and different religion and adapts to the contemporary scenario. And in this contemporary scenario, we have something that was definitely not within the scope of Islam. We have a huge political revision. A new system is introduced, a system that is, at least on the surface, giving power to workers, a system that is dethroning Polish aristocracy, that aristocracy which was so much on the foreground of Polish culture and Polish politics during the Second Rzeczpospolita. And now this particular class is, and including also some lower level nobility, Szlachta, this class is sort of removed, not only just removed, but also attacked, persecuted. So we have the element of persecution, we have the element of treason that is masterfully described by Miłosz, especially when the Home Army officers, higher rank officers, are invited to meet the Soviets, and a lovely, maybe not lovely, but at least a friendly feast turns into a brutal arrest and prison and torture and death. So all the concrete elements, the whole realism of the picture that he is giving us has nothing to do with Persia, has nothing to do with Islam, obviously. The parallel works only so far, but it's interesting that that it's a sort of a disease, that new faith, that Hetman, that comes from elsewhere, that it's not Polish born. It's a phenomenon that comes from the East. So he is orientalizing the whole the process. And this is interesting, especially that he is, it seems to me, following a pattern of thinking about huge historical changes as sort of almost pandemics that come from elsewhere, always from elsewhere. I mean, that's what is, in the Peloponnesian War, where it's a ship that brings, just the foreign element, that it's the foreign element that is, and in the events that fascinated so much, is the beginning of Herbert and his Tulipmania. Everything that is, occurring in this realm of the public mind has roots somewhere else. We can say that it's, of course, not quite true, that we have our own and very much Polish essentially Polish communists, but nationalism, Polishness, Germanness, all those notions, essential and centralizing notions, are foreign to communism. Rosa Luxemburg, who was actually raised on Polish Romantic poetry, is rejecting nationalism, and this is really one of the basic tenets that they embrace. So it helps the fact that Hetman comes from elsewhere, helps Miłosz to deal with that native type of communism. And for example, although he doesn't talk about him, that Gomułka would be the case. So what is Hetman? Is it just a mechanism that is, that is introduced to a whole society, first as a very luring promise, and then as a must, and then as a necessity? Well, I think they are both elements, that it is really a historical necessity that communism would reign, but on the other hand, there is the human, you have to allow it, you have to allow this to take over your own mind. So there are two stages. One is the public stage, and the other one is quite intimate, a stage of a human being's mind, of an individual mind, of something that is in a way hidden and intimate.
So the idea of Hetman is a metaphor that Miłosz uses in his
a cognitive metaphor.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
How about the pill of multi-being? Can we say? I mean, we should probably explain how it works, probably, and indicate the fact that among many qualities of the captive mind, one is the literary one, and the fact that perhaps a part of it is inspired by literature, and specifically by the novel of Hypocrisy. This idea of the pill is also something that it is also a metaphor that allows Miłosz to explain people's attitudes. Simple idea, it seems. You take a pill and you accept the system that otherwise is unacceptable. This seems to be an interesting tool to use by the poet, and he doesn't build much on it later in the work, but he introduces the idea at the beginning of the book, and then he just leaves it, right? And then he probably focuses more on Hetman, but it seems like the two ideas are connected.
Connected, they are. Andrzej, it's very interesting how much time and effort Miłosz puts to reconstruct the motives, the motivations behind the acceptance of communism among Polish intellectuals. Very interesting. And that he is, Witkac's idea is not, the Polish-born idea. Hetman is not the Polish-born idea. And I would say that through the pill, that is somehow reworking one's mind, paralyzing criticism, paralyzing self-distancing, that through that pill, Miłosz is trying to point out a sort of a demonic aspect of communism. And it's there. He doesn't really discuss it later on in a greater detail, but it's there. It is the negative force that through the pill, you know, it just changes one's psyche. And on the ideological level, in the ideological dimension, it's the very deliberate, conscious acceptance of the principles of dialectics. So we have two forces that work here, and that those two forces somehow are supposed to affect our four authors, our four Polish literates. Do I see the pill at work in his analysis of his four protagonists? Not really. It suddenly becomes, I mean, his portraits are so nuanced and also seductively written that actually Hetman somehow is probably a stronger mechanism, a mechanism that he is showing in his analysis, especially of, I would say, Putrament, although, yeah, Putrament probably is the strongest case. It's too bad that he didn't include Krański, but he didn't. Krański was not a literati.
Right. It is so intricate to look at these modes of writing, and Miłosz uses the metaphors. He presents complex analysis, and it shows us that the story being told in the captive mind is a complex one, and Miłosz tries to explain people's attitudes, and he tries to explain his own attitude as well. So there's that subtle analysis that is so striking in my view. Also, when he uses the four portraits that you mentioned at the very beginning, you know, the portraits of four Polish writers, Tadeusz Borowski, Jerzy Andrzejewski, Jerzy Putrament, and Konstanty Ildefons Gałczyński. Miłosz talks about the attitudes throughout the book, but it seems like through the portraits, he gives us examples as to how intellectuals, how writers embrace the new ideology. And what I find intriguing is that in some instances, Miłosz writes about his friends, like Jerzy Andrzejewski, so someone who knew very well. Jerzy Putrament as well was his colleague from the Wilno years. And this are additional tools that Miłosz uses in his analysis. These portraits that he presents can be also viewed as Miłosz's views on literature, not only on politics and on people's attitudes. He precisely analyzes each of the writers, and he explains that if you as a writer embrace Stalinism, you are finished as a writer. So that's the like a personal approach of Miłosz to the issues, especially when he writes about the last of the writers, Gałczyński, the poet. Miłosz sometimes, it seems, would like to refer to himself directly, almost. You may disagree, but when you take into account Miłosz's other essays on Gałczyński, Miłosz sympathizes with Gałczyński as a poet. I'm not talking about the attitude or lifestyle of Gałczyński, but we personal, element in the captive mind.
Yeah, well, all four essays, portraits are, in a sense, about politics of friendship. And in the case of Andrzejewski and Utrament, very close friendships. And the moment when they learned and then read the book, The Captive Mind, they felt betrayed by Miłosz. And we know that Andrzejewski was in a deep shock. So what actually Miłosz created, the new set of tensions that he introduced in those friendships, actually meant not just a new phase in those friendships, but a sort of a end of friendship. Jacques Derrida talks about this phenomenon of friendship as always including the potential of its destruction. Friendship is something that always carries on the potential of being destroyed. And that's definitely quite true in the case of Andrzejewski and Utrament. What is, for me, quite intriguing is that my disagreement with you regarding Gałczyński comes from a certain way. It's actually a dominating principle of the portrait of Gałczyński. It is, he portrays him as a clown with a tragic side, some tragic side. And he is very consistently analyzing Gałczyński in a Chaplinesque manner. Here is a person who, like Charlie Chaplin, comes and wants to dominate the scene. He takes over that small literary stage, be it his friend's apartment or some other places like a cafe. He is the one who seems to be indestructible. Gałczyński, after all those binge drinkings, comes back, writes poems. He is capable of writing, and that's something that Miłosz is a bit fascinated, but also very critical. Actually, Gałczyński can write about anything. He can produce a poem like a machine. And that's, I think he has a very dualistic approach to that. But basically, Gałczyński is a Charlie Chaplin among these Polish bohemian characters. Chaplin and his Charlie Chaplin, of course, as this eternal tramp, has his tragic side. And so Miłosz is aware of that, and Gałczyński too. Could he? No, he could not identify with Gałczyński. Even with the mechanical type of gift that Gałczyński had. Miłosz needed inspiration. Miłosz's archives, Miłosz's manuscripts demonstrate how much time and effort he spent in writing the book. It's incredible. His doodles show us that there is a persistent effort and focus on bringing a poem to life. He doesn't have this mechanistic type of gift that Gałczyński possessed. He may be jealous of it, but not really. No, it would be rather coquettish of him. Miłosz is so much stronger as a poet, and he knew it.
This is probably not an identification, but sympathizing with Gałczyński in some way, because from the 4 portraits, 2 of them are quite positive, despite the criticism contained in the portraits. And the 2 are, it seems, Borowski and Gałczyński. These 2 portraits are more positive than the other 2. So that's what seems visible when one reads the Captive Mind. You mentioned, yes?
Andrzej, so if I would quickly, let's just very quickly go through all those 4 portraits.
Yes.
Not necessarily in the order that they are presented in the book. So we have Gałczyński, who is this tragic clown, who is Chaplin's relative in a way. And then we have Borowski, who is Borowski? The main operating principle in the essay is that he is this disappointed lover, a person who lost his illusions, that there is some sort of a cynicism in him, a healthy cynicism, I am not sure, but definitely a cynicism that is very reductive. And so I think that in the case of Borowski, we have this lost jouissance, this lost joy of life. And it's very interesting how he is framing Putrament, whom he knows from his youth. Putrament is for him a Sarmatian. He has this, he's garrulous, he is from the lower nobility, as Sarmatian should be. He is, he enjoys his kind of a rough, not really polished type of manner. And then we have Andrzejewski, who is also in a sense portrayed without much mercy. And although Andrzejewski's homosexuality is not invoked in this portrait, but it seems to me that Andrzejewski is really very important and actually strategically important for the book, because he is the one who opens the idea of the end of friendship, the destruction of friendship, or maybe an impossibility of true friendship. Nonetheless, Miłosz had such friendships, but this is a topic that Irena Grudzińska-Gross should talk about, not me. So anyway, if we could talk, for example, about these 4 portraits as imagined biographies, they are very close to life. Would you agree? Yeah, and they are very that he respects certain facts and he knows those facts. However, with one exception, this Sarmatian bureaucrat, Jerzy Putrament, actually never played bridge. And it baffles me why Miłosz talks about him as a bridge player. Putrament was a chess player, and he had a book, wrote a book about chess. He also, Zofia Bystrzyńska, Putrament's second wife, came from a very respected bourgeois family in Przemysl, some private businessman family. And he portrays her really like a tractorist, like somebody who comes from the colchoz. She worked there for a brief time, but she was not a person who didn't have a Kinderstube. So it's I think a very loosely historically and factually organized a life. Putrament is really treated in a more nonchalant way. Why? I think that Miłosz was simply trying to stretch the notion of this imaginary biography that is written in a very beautiful way and is not governed by the adherence to facts. I'm talking about the essay about Putrament.
I would agree with you. I do agree with you. I think this kind of presentation of the four portraits, these are literary portraits. They are not, realistic portraits. And I think it goes well with Miłosz's conviction that he formulates in some other texts of his, that sometimes he says the writer must select certain features, sometimes emphasize the others, because if the writer wants to be faithful as much as possible, then he gets lost. I mean, the writing is less effective. So this is about the artist's workshop that he talks about. The art of writing, and it seems like what you just described is the fact that Miłosz indeed was selecting certain facts, distorting out.
No, he actually was adding facts.
He was what?
He added something. He created a fact.
Yes.
Putrament never played bridge. He was a very famous, very skilled chess player, and so it was a very important element actually. Why I don't know why Miłosz changed it. And, I think that this only indicates that the genre of this particular essay is really that of a fictional biography. And in this sense, Miłosz is really doing something that is, well, not original, I don't like that term, but is quite daring. And he risks those comments that I just made when he writes this way. But of course, a fictional biography, which is a very popular type of writing nowadays, existed earlier, and Marcel Schwab was probably the best case. That is, he embellished all those biographies that he wrote deliberately. Miłosz, I think that Miłosz tries to stick to historical facts. At the same time, he writes beautifully. His style is just, it carries the reader on. It's mellifluous.
Yes, and we mentioned earlier that he uses different voices in this book. And the last chapter devoted to the Baltic people apparently is the piece of the work which is more personal than other chapters. And Miłosz acknowledges that in one of the interviews, that he talks about his native land, his fatherland, and he describes the fate of the people who are subjugated by the Soviets and what happens to them. And this is a personal account of Miłosz. For me, this is just a confirmation that Miłosz is a fictional writer, but with a lot of the heavy load of discursive writing that can be, and should be interpreted as, Miłosz's personal statements.
Oh yeah, totally. And in the case of those small 3 Baltic countries, his old fascination with people, unknown people, not those who have a prestige, but just human ciphers. So he is fascinated in the way they are caught in a whirlpool of history. It happened to him too. He was also caught in the whirlpool of history. He emerged successful, and as a more mature person, more aware of himself, of history. But mostly those people were crushed, were sent to Siberia, were crushed in prisons, and those incidental, and the incidental nature of this destruction is something that is forever fascinating him, mesmerizing him.
Mm-hmm. I'm afraid we are coming close to the end of our webinar. You mentioned at the beginning that the captive mind read today is a piece of writing that is not out of date. I don't know if you put it this way exactly. I say the captive mind is a timeless work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is absolutely. Hetman is a deconstruction of a certain universal feature of human nature. This is a book about power. Actually, the second very important literary work about power in Polish tradition. The first one being Bolesław Prus's Pharaoh. And although this is a novel, Prus wrote a novel, but the mechanism of power in the Miłosz's case is much more cruel. It's not just that it's not portrayed in some distant time and distant land. It happens here and now, and it touches his own friends. He was saved. Was it a miracle? No. And if someone analyzes all the steps, all the events that occurred when he ultimately went to the other side of the political state, we know that he was really trying to save himself and to save his inner freedom.
To conclude, I would say that the captive mind is a timeless work and a very present day work. I think today the captive mind might help to answer some questions about people's attitudes that they take, especially, or the choices they make, especially when one considers political life.
The current political life.
In many places, in many countries, it seems like the book can show us how people find the justification for their irrational choices, how people close their minds and make excuses about supporting dubious political causes.
Professor Shallcross, Professor Karcz, thank you very, very much for this very interesting, wonderful presentation and sharing your insights on the deeper meaning of the captive mind with us and with our audience. Thank you. Dear ladies and gentlemen, in our audience, now is time for you to ask questions if you have, and the Q&A feature visible on your screens is of assistance. And awaiting the questions from you, I have prepared also a question which actually you just partially answered. So thank you very much, Professor Karcz, for asking about the relevance of the captive mind nowadays. Yes, actually at the very beginning, Professor Shallcross, you mentioned whether the captive mind is still relevant today. Of course it is, you said, and now you concluded this presentation referring to its relevance nowadays. So my question to you actually is if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on how more on how relevant the captive mind is today. And I would like to also expand the question referring to you because you were university professors. You have many years of experience of working with students, well-read, intelligent, talented students on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And it stands to reason that the captive mind was influenced mostly by the horrific experiences the totalitarian regime of the 20th century brought on people. And nowadays, these students of yours, especially in Poland, young people, they enjoy freedom, they can travel freely around the world, they can benefit from the many educational and exchange programs, scholarship programs, so they can travel, they can meet other people and cultures. So the question is to you and also to them, to the students of yours. The captive mind, is it more a relic of the past or continues to be a tool to keep and retain the non-captive mind today? What's your take on?
Well, I think that if I may answer first, if one thinks of a certain particular aspect of Miłosz's analysis, it is that sudden, seemingly unwarranted turn that occurs in a person, in a man, in a woman, that sudden change of political position. I think that this phenomenon we observe on a daily basis. We see people who are conservative and who, go to the opposite political side and vice versa. But, the concrete historical facts and that you talked about are different. We live in a different systemic order. So it's democracy. And that's why when you talked about the youth that is enjoying traveling, for example, yes, that also, unfortunately, I don't know whether it's the case with, for instance, our audience, but I am very much aware that Miłosz was actually rejected by his poetry was rejected by the Polish young people, and they have their poets, they have their causes, and so as a poet, I love Miłosz. I copied him for myself when his works were illegal. But well, actually, I think it's a different case with this volume of essays. And this volume of essays can teach everybody about those seemingly imperceptible processes that occur when a person is changing his hair colors, so to speak. And here is the lesson for the youth, for the young people to learn.
I would add that the book is about attitudes, people's attitudes and people's way of thinking. So the analysis that Miłosz presents up to date in many respects. We can draw certain lessons from the captive mind today. How people sometimes try to cheat themselves simply, and what justification they find for their wrong choices in general. And the book, based on certain historical facts, and we know history is always a great lesson. Showing the extremities of the conditions and the fact that certain attitudes can lead to crime. This is something that is part of human life. So Miłosz's book is about that, and it's based, I emphasize, on certain historical events, very tragic historical events of the middle of the 20th century. A very convincing account by Miłosz says this is an account of someone who himself experienced certain situations. He met certain people, he encountered all kinds of pressures that he needed to overcome. And he, as a writer, is very effective in presenting this problem.
Thank you. Actually, we received a comment from Ms. Eva Jędruch, who says that the present-day captivity would be relevant now, but in the case of Miłosz, it was influenced by a definite ideology. Presently, it seems to lack a specific ideology. Please comment on that.
That the captive mind lacks an ideology, or was based?
No, the other way around. I understand it, that it's today's attitudes.
Present-day captivity would be relevant now, but in the case of Miłosz, it was influenced by a definite ideology. Presently, it seems to lack a specific ideology. Question mark. Please comment.
The present day. Well, it's actually very good commentary that reminds us that we are in a certain post-ideological phase of our civilization, and that consumerism is taking over, but at the same time, the captive mind is a psychological analysis. It analyzes in great detail what motivates people to make a turn, to accept a certain ideology that is a betrayal of his previous values. So this, I think, is whether one accepts ideology or one accepts in the post-ideological era consumerism, or its opposite, whether one accepts globalization or environmental activism. Does it really matter? as long as the question of being true to himself, herself, is most important.
Okay, here it begins. We have a comment from an anonymous attendee. Perhaps the present day captivity is a certain political correctness. And a comment from David Goldfarb. Hello, David. Thanks, Bożena and Andrzej, for your fascinating discussion. How do you distinguish between Miłosz's idea of Ketman as he adapts it from Islam and related concepts like the psychological idea of denial or the Marxist idea of false consciousness?
Yeah. Oh, you know, this is in the case of Miłosz. There is the idea of Ketman is tainted by Orientalization, and so Orientalization that is based, as according to Edward Said, on the certain superiority of the West over East. So this is really a moment, at least in my reading of the book, that is difficult for me to accept, and I do not accept it. But yes, indeed, I prefer to talk about the denial, yes, which more or less, you know, tells us that yes, I know that it is not true. Nonetheless, I am for it. So this type of denial, this type of a mechanism is exactly what Ketman is about. Miłosz describes Ketman as a very intricate form of art, of living, of self-defense, of survival, in a very under a very dominating form of power. Do we have to follow such a code nowadays? I don't know. I think that a simple allegiance to a semi-dictator or a dictator is enough. And perhaps a form of a court exists in Moscow, but perhaps in Poland, but this is not something that I can talk about. I really am not an expert on this subject.
Nothing to add from me.
We have also a comment from Evelina K, who refers to other followers of Miłosz, including Cyrograph by Fleshen, and she thanks you very much for the analysis. I have also one question that does not relate to the captive mind. It is often highlighted that Miłosz felt at odds with capitalism, and he reacted quite strongly to some aspects of American culture. And the question is, in the decades following his arrival to the United States and becoming a lecturer at the University of California at Berkeley, did he become more of an American poet or continued to be more of an outsider within American culture? Not related, but related with Miłosz, not related with captive mind.
I would say that this is not so certain as to the criticism of capitalism by Miłosz, because he might be hesitant about capitalism, but writing about it against the background of the system he escaped, he speaks positively about capitalism. He may be a negative critic of consumerism and mass culture, but on the other hand, when he makes a comparison that capitalism is like a small broken boat on the sea, but communism is a huge vessel, huge ship, and sometimes it happens that the huge ship is not able to go through the all kinds of straits the way the small broken boat can go through. So he makes this he creates this metaphorical image in the captive mind. So here, while leaving the communist country, he's saying that, capitalism probably has more to offer than the system he's leaving behind.
It seems to me that what it offers is, if we follow this parable, is a space to maneuver, more space to maneuver. However one understands both the maneuvers and the space.
I must have read it, yes, in some articles. I don't remember where, but I recall that this article said that he was so at odds with both communism and capitalism, and that he even considered moving to somewhere, to some farm in, I think, some third world country. So it's a good for us all that did not happen, because that would be a huge waste of talent. Professor Shallcross, Professor Karcz, thank you very, very much for your in-depth and thought-provoking analysis on the works of Czesław Miłosz and sharing with us with your insights about the deep meaning of this seminal work. Thank you all who joined us for this webinar. Our next episode in the literary series will feature a presentation by Dr. Agnieszka Kromkowska-Dąbrowska, also from the Polish, in the Institute of Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences, and she will be speaking about the generosity of narrative by Wiesław Myśliwski, two-time winner of the Nika Award, Poland's top literary award, and the video recording will premiere on YouTube on July 8th. And now, for those of you who happen to join us today for the first time, just a quick note: the Kościuszko Foundation, the American Center for Polish Culture, has nearly a century-long tradition of building bridges between Poland and the United States. On average, $1 million a year is given away to scholars and students, both from Poland and the United States. So these are these bridges in question. In addition to that, the foundation also promotes Polish culture and Polish literature through events and webinars such as the one today. So if you are a member of the foundation, that's fantastic. Thank you. If not, you are most welcome to join us as a member. And with this note, I would like to conclude this webinar, wishing you all a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much. Goodbye.